Hello, my name is John White, and today I'm going to be talking about the effects of wildfires on aquatic ecosystems. So as you've all probably noticed, there's a lot of negative effects that have happened, like at first sight. But what I'm focusing on mainly is could there actually be positive effects to wildfires? So, the main focus of my project is to focus on the short-term effects, long-term effects, fate of woody debris, which could include experiment and community involvement. I'll get to that later. Key findings and conclusions. So, moving into short-term effects, this is where most of the negative effects happen. As you can see, there's a lot of mud left over from the fire runoff. This isn't the best photo, but there's a lot of wood around that comes from the burnt trees when it floods. And so yeah, basically, short-term effects are where the negative effects are. So one big factor that's probably has one of the worst effects on rivers are debris flows, and that is when rain comes down and basically creates a flood that washes away all the burnt logs and debris, trees, etc. And that all goes into the river, and the ash and mud that comes into the river with that can get into fish's gills and basically abrade them, which is why they'll die shortly after. Another big part that fires play when it comes to harmful effects is that it covers the bottom of the river in a layer of mud, and essentially what that does, it eliminates habitat for macroinvertebrates to live. Like, many of them depend on river bottoms and under rocks to basically live, reproduce, and if there's a mud layer covering the bottom, then basically fish can't find food and they'll starve, like the ones that do live. So, some of the fish in the Animas River were more affected than others, and the most affected fish was what's called the flannel sucker. That's what that is. They're adapted to live in cleaner water, even though the Animas isn't the cleanest of water. They can live there, but basically their gills are a lot more fragile than the trout species, so they'll basically get abraded really easily by the sediment, and they're the ones that are mostly affected. So moving on to community involvement part, I'd like to start off with emergency fish rescues. And basically this photo is showing, that's what you would call electrofishing if you haven't heard of it already. It's basically where you have a probe that electrifies the water and it stuns fish that you can then net them with. It doesn't kill them, it's harmless. But anyways, if the river conditions get like this because of a fire, like the 416 fire, they can basically go out, try and catch as many fish as they can from deeper pools, and while the river is recovering, they can live in the fish hatchery. So moving into the long-term effects is where we can start to see some of the positive changes. Yeah, in this picture it's pretty much just an example of woody debris, like logs. And you can also see the orange tags on the logs. I'll get to that later. But, yeah. So, one of the first positive effects that I observed, I took this picture. It was a while ago. It was after the Parents Peak fire. And this is where the watershed originally was, and basically all the ash from the fire created really good nutrients, which allowed plants like these ferns to grow, and that's only about a month after the fire went through there. So yeah, it's a really noticeable positive effect that I thought was pretty interesting. So fish habitat. Another, sorry. So yeah, basically when the wood travels downriver, a lot of it will get stuck and create pools for fish. And the reason this can be really good is because if they're behind the log, and basically bugs that float down will come in because of the current, and it basically provides food for them, as well as they don't have to use as much energy because they're behind the log, which absorbs the flowing water. So moving on to one of my bigger studies. That's my dog, by the way. So the Fata woody debris study is probably my biggest portion that I'm going to do for my action project. And basically for this, we first decided just by estimating if wood would have a high, low, or medium chance of movement. And basically what that means is, say a log was like half buried in the mud, you would label that a low chance of movement because it would most likely stay there, and like the spring floods most likely wouldn't take it down the river. And say a log that just was sitting like in the water, not really in the ground, that would be a log that you would classify as a higher chance of movement because it doesn't take much for it to move. It's not embedded in the ground too much. So where does woody debris go? So this part of the test is where we took orange tags, 25 of them to be exact, and nailed them into different logs. And basically what that's going to do is, most likely within the next month and a half, we'll kayak down the river and basically record where we find each one of those orange tags in order to conduct where the river brought the logs, where it formed good fish habitat. And for the community involvement part of this project, I created flyers, and those flyers will go around the river stores in Durango, like Four Corners River Sports, Animus River Days, etc. So what we exactly did for the tagging study, we first, as I said, tagged 25 logs. We measured each log, calculated the volume, characterized mobility, and that means what I said earlier, high, medium, low chance of movement, and recorded the GPS location of each log. So this chart right here shows the results in size of the logs. As you can see, farther out is where the bigger logs were, and we did a few full-size tree trunks, and most of them were mediums to small trees, right where those circles are. So that's where the average log size was, those circles. So again, movement category, this pie chart is basically showing what percent of logs were high, medium, and low. So the higher chances was actually the lowest one, because most of the logs that we observed were in the ground, and a few of them, which would be labeled high, like that one in the right hand corner. And yeah, so low and medium were both at 40%. Yeah. So how can fish use woody debris? It basically depends. It depends on the floodplain, river channel, and size. So basically, like, the Animas River would be a pretty good river for fish to use woody debris, mostly because it's not huge, but it's bigger in size, and because of its size, it's not going to, like, necessarily clog the river or anything. So it will basically just have sporadic locations where woody debris gets stuck and fish can live. Whereas, like, a smaller creek, like Hermosa Creek, will probably be more affected because there's too much wood coming down it right now for the river to handle, so it's creating a lot of big dams and waterfalls that are too big for fish to jump over, and during reproducing season, it's essential for fish to swim upstream a lot of the times. So that's definitely a big factor for smaller streams. So, this slide right here, this would be an example of basically woody debris located in a place where it would be useful for fish, because as you can see, it's out in the water, it's around a few other logs. It's basically creating a smaller pool in which the fish can live in, find food. So I would say for the key findings of this project, basically the findings that I found to be most important, was that fires are very devastating at first, and the debris flows are basically what cause the first site negative effects, which is why a lot of people think that fires are a lot more devastating than they actually are. So watersheds start to stabilize. That's another key finding. That's basically when, like, the recovery process starts happening, like more plants grow. And what I found very interesting was that basically a while after a forest is burned, it's actually a lot less likely to erode. Anything's a lot less likely to erode in the river because the thick vegetation that grows back holds in the soil. So if it does burn again, there wouldn't be as big of flooding going into the river because there would be more vegetation and roots to hold in the soil. And so what I took away from these findings is that wildfires appear devastating at first. However, in the long term, they can be very beneficial due to nutrients, due to like nutrient growth, and also what can happen is like macroinvertebrates that basically live in the bottom, like the ash will settle and it will eventually provide good nutrients not only on land but in the water. So it can basically provide plants that they can find nutrition off of. And that right there is my flyer that I made. It's basically just saying, attention boaters, it's part of an Animas High School study on the 416 fire effects on the Animas River. We are asking boaters to report any tagged logs they see. Fish and aquatic invertebrates may use burn logs for habitat. And then my number. And basically this is just so if anyone does see this, they can give us a call. Because, I mean, we're most likely not going to find every tagged log. So what we're hoping to get out of these flyers is basically just for a few people to call. and just report if they saw one where it was, so then we can look for it in the future. So yeah, thank you for coming to my senior TED Talk.
Thanks, John. All right, questions from the panel?
How would you describe your adventure through this project?
Well, I've done a lot of work with my dad because he is basically the manager of the fish hatchery, so I've gotten to do electrofishing. Like, I was part of the emergency fish rescue, so we went out when the animus was like at its worst and basically tried to catch as many fish as we could from the pools. Yeah, I've just done a lot of studies and worked with a lot of professionals.
Can you help me understand more about the importance of aquatic life? Like, why should we care about
Yeah, so,
fish?
I mean, for one reason we should care is because the Animas River is basically classified as gold water fishing, which basically means it's like top ranking for places that people want to fish. So, and there's like fishing guides and stuff that go along the river. So, and if there was no fish in the river, people like wouldn't be buying stuff from fly shops as much. Companies could even go out of business, like if there wasn't any fish in the river. Plus, a lot of the fish that are in the river are native species, and one of the most protected species is the cutthroat trout, and they also live in the river. So, like, if they all died, then it could be virtually impossible to restore their population. So that's another reason.
How long does it typically take for a watershed to stabilize and for those short-term impacts to start to like even out?
I'd say for a watershed to stabilize, it's still like quite a long time. Like, in the scale of like 100 years, the negative effects are pretty long, but so yeah, like even now, like the river is being restocked with fish, their population's starting to re-go, and the 416 fire was only about 8 months ago, so.
So wait, I'm confused because you just said 100 years and then you said like 8 months.
So yeah,
ago, so
basically the negative effects usually last around 8 months to a year. Like right now, the Animas River is starting its recovery process.
Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. And then can I ask one more follow-up question? What is the most interesting study that you read as you were researching for this?
Probably an article written by Robert E. Greswell. He's basically like one of the co-founders of Mountain Studies Institute, and he had a whole article basically on negative and positive effects of the river, and I'd say that's where a lot of my information came from. That was probably my most helpful source in this project so far.
Any questions?
All right, thank you very much, John. We'll send you outside for a moment.